In a busy courtroom in the heart of Chicago, the air buzzed with anticipation. The room was packed with people, some curious onlookers, others deeply invested in the case about to unfold. At the center of it all stood a young man, barely in his 20s, sitting nervously at the defense table. His suit looked a little too big for him, borrowed from someone kind enough to lend it for the occasion. He glanced around the room, taking in the sea of faces staring back at him. Despite the weight of the moment, there was something steady in his eyes, a quiet determination that seemed out of place for someone so young. On the other side of the room sat Margaret Hensley, an experienced prosecutor known for her sharp tongue and unshakable confidence. She had been practicing law for over 2 decades and had built a reputation as one of the toughest lawyers in the city. Today's case, she thought, would be just another notch on her belt. After all, how hard could it be to win against a kid with no formal legal training? As she flipped through the files in front of her, she couldn't help but smirk. This wasn't going to take long. The judge entered the room, and everyone rose to their feet. Once the formalities were out of the way, the proceedings began. Tatikoe, young man, was accused of vandalism during a protest that had turned chaotic. According to the prosecution, he had spray-painted graffiti on a public building, causing damage and disorder. When the judge asked if the defendant had legal representation, the young man shook his head. "No, Your Honor," he said firmly. "I'll represent myself." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Self-representation was rare, especially in cases like this. Margaret leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. She exchanged a glance with her assistant, who raised an eyebrow. "This should be interesting," she whispered under her breath, her tone dripping with sarcasm. To Margaret, the young man looked like any other person caught up in trouble, someone who probably didn't know the first thing about the law. What she didn't realize, however, was that this wasn't just some ordinary kid. For years he had worked tirelessly, juggling odd jobs while teaching himself everything he could about the legal system. Late nights spent reading dusty law books in the corner of a library had given him knowledge most people only gained after years of schooling. But none of that was visible on the surface. To Margaret, he was just another nameless face, easy prey for her courtroom tactics. As the trial began, Margaret took full control of the narrative. Her opening statement was polished, confident, and designed to paint the young man as reckless and irresponsible. "Your Honor," she said, addressing the judge with calculated precision, "we're dealing with someone who clearly lacks understanding of basic legal principles. Maybe he thinks this is some kind of game, but let me assure you it isn't." The gallery chuckled softly, though a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't sure why, but something about Margaret's words felt off. The young man listened intently, his expression calm despite the mockery directed at him. He knew exactly what Margaret was doing, trying to rattle him, make him doubt himself. But instead of letting her words get to him, he used them as fuel. Every snide comment, every condescending remark only strengthened his resolve. He reminded himself why he was here, not just to prove his innocence, but to show that he wasn't defined by anyone else's assumptions. When it came time for the young man to present his opening statement, he stood slowly, adjusting his tie, before speaking. His voice wavered slightly at first, betraying his nerves, but as he continued, it grew steadier. He spoke plainly without the theatrics Margaret had employed, focusing instead on the facts. "I'm not guilty of what I'm accused of," he said simply, "and I believe the truth will come out as we go through this process." Margaret rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Let's hope so," she muttered loud enough for the judge to hear. The young man ignored her, choosing instead to focus on the task ahead. Little did Margaret know, she had already made her first mistake, underestimating her opponent. And in the world of law, underestimation can be costly. The stage was set, the tension in the courtroom was palpable, and everyone could sense that this trial wouldn't follow the usual script. For now, Margaret held the upper hand, but the young man wasn't afraid of a challenge. In fact, he welcomed it. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about proving that even those dismissed as insignificant could rise above expectations. And as the next phase of the trial approached, he was ready to fight with everything he had. As the trial moved forward, Margaret wasted no time in taking charge. She called her first witness to the stand, a police officer who claimed to have seen the young man near the scene of the alleged vandalism. The officer was a tall, stern-looking figure with years of experience under his belt. He sat upright, his hands resting on the railing of the witness box, ready to recount what he had observed that night. Margaret approached him with a practiced smile, her tone friendly but commanding. "Officer," she began, "can you tell the court what you saw on the evening in question?" The officer nodded and launched into a detailed account. According to him, he had been patrolling the area when he noticed someone spray painting a wall close to where the protest was happening. He described the person as wearing dark clothing and a hoodie, matching the description of the young man sitting at the defense table. The young man listened carefully, his eyes fixed on the officer. He didn't interrupt or show any visible reaction, but inside his mind was racing. He knew this testimony was central to the prosecution's case, and if he didn't challenge it effectively, things could quickly spiral out of control. Margaret, sensing an easy win, turned to him with a smug grin. "Your turn," she said, gesturing toward the witness. Her tone was almost playful, as if she were indulging a child. The young man stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the table for support. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Walking over to the witness, he began his cross-examination. At first, his questions seemed simple, almost too basic. "Officer, can you confirm the exact time you claim to have seen this individual?" he asked. The officer hesitated briefly before answering, glancing at his notes. "Around 9:15 p.m., the officer replied confidently, but the young man wasn't done. He pressed further, asking about the lighting conditions, the distance between the officer and the alleged vandal, and whether the officer had actually seen the person's face clearly. Each question was deliberate, designed to expose gaps in the testimony. Margaret watched from her seat, her smile fading slightly as she realized the young man was more prepared than she had anticipated. But Margaret wasn't one to back down easily. Sensing that her witness might be struggling, she stepped in to guide him. "Let's not overcomplicate things," she interjected, addressing the judge. "The officer is simply stating what he observed. I'm sure we don't need a lecture on optics." Her comment drew a few chuckles from the gallery, but the young man remained unfazed. Instead of reacting, he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I continue?" he asked politely. The judge nodded, and the young man resumed his questioning. Things got interesting when the young man pulled out a map of the area where the incident supposedly occurred. Pointing to specific locations, he asked the officer to clarify his position at the time of the alleged crime. "You said you were standing here, correct?" he asked, marking a spot on the map. The officer nodded. "Then how is it possible that you could see someone spray painting a wall from such a distance, especially given the angle of the streetlights?" The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm not sure," he admitted after a pause. Margaret's face tightened. She hadn't expected this level of detail from someone representing themselves. Her confidence began to crack, though she tried hard to mask it. Turning to the judge, she argued, "This line of questioning is irrelevant. We're here to discuss facts, not hypotheticals." The young man didn't argue. Instead, he calmly returned to his seat, satisfied that he had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. Margaret, however, wasn't willing to let him gain the upper hand without a fight. During her redirect examination, she attempted to reinforce the officer's credibility by highlighting his years of service and expertise, but the damage had already been done. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. Later, during a brief recess, Margaret found herself replaying the cross-examination in her head. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had underestimated the young man. His questions weren't random. They were calculated, showing a deep understanding of legal strategy. How had he learned to think like that? Was it instinct, or had he truly studied the law? When the session resumed, Margaret decided to take matters into her own hands. She walked over to the young man's table and handed him a thick stack of documents. "Here's the evidence you requested earlier," she said curtly. "Let's see if you can make sense of it." Her tone was condescending, meant to intimidate him, but the young man simply thanked her and began flipping through the pages, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Margaret returned to her seat, leaning over to whisper to her assistant. "He's bluffing," she muttered. "There's no way. He knows what he's doing." Her assistant nodded, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. They both watched as the young man highlighted sections of the documents, jotting down notes in the margins. Whatever he was planning, it was clear he wasn't going to back down. As the day wore on, the courtroom atmosphere shifted subtly. What had started as a seemingly straightforward case was now filled with tension and unpredictability. Margaret's usual dominance was being challenged, and she didn't like it one bit. Every time she tried to mock or belittle the young man, he responded with quiet confidence, turning her words against her. It was as if he thrived under pressure, using her arrogance to fuel his own determination. By the end of the session, the gallery was buzzing with whispered conversations. People leaned toward each other, sharing theories about what they had just witnessed. Some admired the young man's courage, while others wondered how far his knowledge would carry him. Margaret, meanwhile, sat silently, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being several steps ahead of her opponents, but this time, she wasn't so sure. For the first time in her career, she felt a pang of doubt creeping in. And yet, despite the growing unease, Margaret refused to admit defeat. Not yet anyway. As the judge adjourned the session for the day, she gathered her papers and left the courtroom, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Outside, she paused for a moment, staring at the city skyline. Somewhere deep down, she knew the next phase of the trial would be crucial. If she wanted to win, she would have to rethink her strategy, and fast. Back inside the courtroom, the young man packed up his belongings, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He hadn't expected the day to go perfectly, but he had managed to hold his ground. More importantly, he had shown everyone, including Margaret, that he wasn't someone to be dismissed lightly. As he stepped out into the hallway, he allowed himself a small smile. The battle was far from over, but for now he had proven that he belonged in the fight. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread about the unexpected twists of the previous day, and more people showed up to watch the proceedings. Reporters scribbled notes in the back, while spectators whispered among themselves, speculating on how things would unfold. The air was thick with tension, but also curiosity. No one could deny that something unusual was happening here, something far removed from the typical courtroom drama. Margaret arrived early, her usual polished appearance slightly undone by the faint lines of stress around her eyes. She spent the first few minutes before the trial began flipping through her notes, trying to anticipate what the young man might do next. Her assistant hovered nearby, offering suggestions, but she barely acknowledged him. For once, Margaret felt uncertain, and it wasn't a feeling she enjoyed. When the judge entered and called the court to order, Margaret wasted no time getting down to business. She announced that she would present new evidence, surveillance footage from a nearby security camera. "This video clearly shows the accused committing the act," she declared confidently, addressing both the jury and the gallery. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the lights dimmed and a grainy black-and-white video appeared on a screen, mounted at the front of the room. In the footage, a figure wearing a hoodie moved quickly across the frame, spray-painting a wall. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough to suggest wrongdoing. Margaret pointed dramatically at the screen. "There he is, Your Honor, caught red-handed." Her voice carried an edge of triumph, as if she had finally cornered her opponent. The gallery murmured in agreement, some nodding their heads. It looked damning, but the young man didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, studying the video intently. When Margaret finished her presentation, she turned to him with a smug grin. "Your turn," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "Unless you'd like to save us all some time and admit guilt?" Instead of responding immediately, The young man stood up slowly. He walked over to the judge's bench and requested permission to present his own evidence. The judge granted it, though Margaret rolled her eyes, clearly skeptical. What could this kid possibly have that would counteract such clear-cut proof? What happened next stunned everyone in the room. The young man pulled out his laptop and connected it to the projector. On the screen, he displayed not just the prosecution's video, but also high-resolution photographs taken earlier that day. These images showed details the grainy footage couldn't capture. Things like shadows cast by buildings, reflections in puddles, and even the unique design of the shoes worn by the person in the video. With methodical precision, he began pointing out inconsistencies. "Notice the position of the sun in these photos," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If the incident occurred at 9:15 p.m., as the officer testified, then the lighting in this video doesn't match reality. The shadow patterns indicate it must have been closer to 7:30 p.m. He paused, letting the information sink in. "Furthermore, look at the footwear. The person in the video is wearing sneakers with a distinct logo, a brand I've never owned." The gallery erupted into murmurs. People craned their necks to get a better view of the screen, comparing the images side by side. Even the jurors leaned forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to intrigue. Margaret's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected this level of detail, or this level of preparation. But the young man wasn't done yet. Using timestamps from the video and data from public transit schedules, he demonstrated that it would have been physically impossible for him to be at the scene when the alleged crime took place. "According to bus records," he explained, pulling up another document, "I boarded a bus heading in the opposite direction at 8:45 p.m. That gives me an alibi confirmed by multiple witnesses." Margaret tried to interrupt, arguing that his calculations were speculative, but the judge allowed him to continue. By the time he finished presenting his evidence, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Doubt crept into the faces of the jurors, and even Margaret seemed rattled. She glanced at her assistant, who avoided her gaze, fumbling with his notes. Desperate to regain control, Margaret launched into a fiery rebuttal. She accused the young man of cherry-picking data and manipulating facts to suit his narrative. "This isn't science, it's speculation," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "You can't just throw numbers and pictures at us and expect us to believe your story." To her surprise, the young man didn't react defensively. Instead, he smiled faintly, almost sympathetically. "With respect, Ms. Hensley," he said, addressing her directly for the first time, "the law is built on evidence. If my arguments seem convincing, maybe it's because they're based on truth, not assumptions." His words hung in the air, silencing the room. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. For the first time in her career, she found herself at a loss. The confidence that had defined her throughout the trial was crumbling, replaced by doubt and frustration. As the session drew to a close, the judge thanked both parties and adjourned the court until the following day. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed around Margaret, peppering her with questions. She brushed them off curtly, her usual composure shattered. Meanwhile, the young man slipped away quietly, avoiding the media circus. Back in his small apartment, he sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of legal books piled high around him. Despite the day's success, he knew the battle wasn't over. Margaret wouldn't give up easily, and he needed to stay sharp. That night, as Margaret lay awake in bed, replaying the events of the day in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had underestimated her opponent. The young man's knowledge of the law was impressive, yes, but it was his calm demeanor and strategic thinking that truly unnerved her. She realized now that mocking him had been a mistake, one that might cost her dearly. For the first time in years, Margaret felt vulnerable, and deep down she knew she had two choices: adapt or lose. As dawn broke over the city, she resolved to come back stronger. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder, what else? Did this young man have up his sleeve? The next day in court felt different. The energy was heavier, charged with anticipation. People were talking more openly now, not just about the case, but about the young man at the center of it all. Some whispered that he might actually pull off a win, while others still doubted anyone could outsmart someone like Margaret Hensley. Either way, no one wanted to miss what happened next. Margaret walked into the courtroom earlier than usual, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She carried herself with her usual confidence, but there was something different. Her movements seemed stiffer, less relaxed. She spent several minutes arranging her papers on the table, stacking them neatly and then restacking them again as if looking for something to distract her from the growing knot in her stomach. Her assistant tried to offer words of encouragement, but she waved him off. "I've got this," she muttered under her breath, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than anyone else. When the judge entered and called the court to order, Margaret stood up quickly, ready to take charge. She announced that she would call her final witness, a city official who had inspected the damage caused by the graffiti. This was supposed to be her ace card, a way to hammer home the seriousness of the alleged crime and tie everything together. The official took the stand, dressed in a crisp suit exuding authority. He spoke confidently, describing the extent of the damage and estimating repair costs. Margaret nodded along, satisfied that she was finally regaining control of the narrative. But when it came time for cross-examination, the young man didn't hesitate. He approached the witness calmly, his demeanor polite but focused. At first, his questions seemed harmless enough, basic inquiries about how the inspection was conducted and whether any other incidents had occurred nearby. The official answered, smoothly, sticking to his script. But then the young man shifted gears. "Sir," he began, his tone still respectful but sharper now, "can you confirm whether the graffiti was removed immediately after the incident or left untouched for several days?" The official hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Well, it wasn't removed right away," he admitted reluctantly. "Budget constraints delayed the cleanup." The young man nodded, letting the silence stretch for a moment, before continuing. "So, essentially, the damage wasn't urgent enough to address immediately, yet we're here today discussing it as if it's a major crisis. Isn't that interesting?" The gallery erupted into murmurs and even the jurors exchanged glances. Margaret shot a glare at the young man, but he ignored her, pressing on. He then asked the official about the exact location of the graffiti and whether there had been any prior complaints about vandalism in the area. When the official confirmed that the spot had been targeted multiple times before, the young man turned to the jury. "This isn't an isolated incident," he said, simply. "It's part of a pattern, and if the city hasn't taken steps to prevent it, why should one person bear the blame?" Margaret jumped in immediately, objecting to what she called irrelevant commentary. But the judge overruled her, allowing the young man to continue. By the time he finished questioning the official, the prosecution's argument was starting to look shaky. The damage didn't seem as significant as Margaret had made it out to be, and the timeline of events raised more questions than answers. As the morning session wrapped up, Margaret retreated to a private room during the lunch break, pacing back and forth. She replayed every interaction in her head, searching for where things had gone wrong. She had been so sure of her case, so confident in her ability to dominate the courtroom. Yet here she was, struggling to keep up with someone who shouldn't have stood a chance. It infuriated her, but worse, it scared her. Her assistant tried to reassure her. "You're still ahead," he said cautiously. "Just focus on closing arguments. That's where you shine." Margaret nodded, though she didn't feel convinced. Closing arguments were her strong suit, but this trial had already defied expectations at every turn. What if her usual tactics didn't work this time? Back in the courtroom, the young man used the break to review his notes and gather his thoughts. He wasn't celebrating yet. He knew better than to let his guard down. Instead, he reminded himself why he was fighting, not just for his freedom, but to prove that people like him deserved respect and fairness. He thought about all the nights he'd spent reading law books, jotting down notes, and dreaming of a future where he could make a difference. This was his moment to show the world what he was capable of. When the afternoon session began, Margaret delivered her closing argument with practiced precision. She spoke passionately about justice, responsibility, and the importance of holding individuals accountable for their actions. Her voice rose and fell dramatically, punctuated by gestures meant to emphasize her points. She painted the young man as reckless and irresponsible, someone who thought the rules didn't apply to him. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might sway the jury. Then it was the young man's turn. He stood slowly adjusting his tie before addressing the court. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, "this case isn't just about me, it's about fairness, it's about truth. And it's about making sure that everyone, even those without power or privilege, is treated equally under the law." He went on to summarize the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, pointing out the lack of concrete evidence linking him to the crime. He talked about the alibi he had presented, the flaws in the surveillance footage, and the broader context of the situation. But most importantly, he spoke from the heart. "I'm not perfect," he admitted. "No one is. But I'm standing here today because I believe in doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when people doubt you or dismiss you. Because, in the end, it's not about winning or losing. It's about staying true to yourself and fighting for what's right." The room was silent when he finished. You could hear a pin drop. Margaret stared at him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she saw him not as an opponent to crush, but as someone who genuinely cared about justice. It was a humbling realization, one that left her feeling unsettled. As the judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations, the gallery buzzed with quiet conversation. People debated the merits of the case, weighing the arguments they'd heard. Some admired the young man's courage and intelligence, while others remained skeptical. No one could deny, however, that they had witnessed something extraordinary. For Margaret, the wait was agonizing. She sat stiffly at her table, tapping her pen against her notebook. Every glance at the jury door made her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had underestimated her opponent, and that mistake might cost her everything. In the end, the jury deliberated for nearly 3 hours. When they finally returned, the tension in the room was unbearable. The foreperson handed the verdict slip to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. After reading it silently, the judge looked up and addressed the court. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, standing up. "And what is your decision?" The foreperson took a deep breath and said the 2 words that changed everything. "Not guilty." The gallery erupted into cheers, and the young man exhaled deeply, tears streaming down his face. Margaret sat frozen, staring at the table in front of her. She hadn't lost a case in years, and now here she was, defeated not by another seasoned lawyer, but by someone who had taught himself everything he knew. For the young man, the victory was bittersweet. He had proven his innocence, yes, but he also knew the fight for justice was far from over. As he left the courtroom surrounded by supporters, he vowed to keep pushing forward, to use his experience to help others who didn't have a voice. And as for Margaret, she walked out quietly, her head held high despite the loss. She didn't know it yet, but this trial would change her too. It would force her to confront her biases, rethink her approach, and maybe, just maybe, become a better advocate, not just for her clients, but for fairness itself. The courtroom buzzed with energy as the verdict echoed through the room. Not guilty. Those 2 simple words carried so much weight, not just for the young man standing at the defense table, but for everyone who had witnessed the trial unfold. The gallery erupted into applause, some people cheering loudly while others exchanged knowing looks. It was a moment of triumph, but also one that left many reflecting on what they had seen, a reminder that sometimes justice isn't about power or experience. It's about truth and determination. For the young man, the relief was overwhelming. He slumped back into his chair, letting out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for days. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped tears from his face. All those late nights studying law books, all the moments when he doubted himself, it had all led to this. He glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had supported him, friends, family, even strangers who had shown up out of curiosity and stayed to root for him. Their smiles gave him strength, but deep down he knew this victory wasn't just for him. It was for anyone who had ever been written off or underestimated because of where they came from or what they looked like. Margaret, on the other hand, sat motionless at her table. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't move when the judge dismissed the court or when the crowd began filing out. Instead, she stared straight ahead, lost in thought. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. In her decades of practicing law, she had always prided herself on being untouchable, on never losing ground to an opponent. But today, she hadn't just lost a case. She had been humbled by someone she had dismissed without a second thought. Her assistant tried to console her, offering vague reassurances about how these things happen to everyone. "It's one case," he said gently. "You'll bounce back." But Margaret barely heard him. Her mind was racing, replaying every interaction with the young man over the past few days. She remembered the way she had mocked him, the condescending remarks she had made under her breath. Now those words felt heavy, almost unbearable. For the first time, she realized how much damage arrogance could do, not just to others, but to herself. As the courtroom emptied, the young man gathered his belongings slowly, savoring the quiet moment. Outside, reporters waited eagerly, microphones in hand, ready to capture his reaction. But before stepping into the chaos, he took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay grounded. When he finally emerged, the flashes of cameras nearly blinded him. Questions flew at him from every direction. How does it feel to win? What's next for you? Did you expect this outcome? He held up a hand, signaling for calm. I'm grateful for the verdict, he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind around him. But this isn't just about me. It's about showing that no matter where you come from or what challenges you face, you can stand up for yourself and fight for what's right. That's what I hope people take away from this. His words resonated deeply, not just with the reporters scribbling notes, but with the ordinary people watching from afar. Social media lit up with posts praising his courage and intelligence. Some shared their own stories of overcoming adversity, inspired by his journey. Others criticized the system, pointing out how rare it was for someone like him to get a fair shot. Regardless of their perspectives, everyone agreed on one thing: something remarkable had happened in that courtroom. Meanwhile, Margaret lingered inside, avoiding the media frenzy outside. She packed her files methodically, her movements slow and deliberate. Her assistant hovered nearby, unsure whether to speak or leave her alone. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he ventured a question. "Are you okay?" Margaret paused, her hands resting on the edge of the table. "No," she admitted quietly. "I'm not." It was the first time she had ever admitted vulnerability in front of anyone, let alone a subordinate. "I messed up, I underestimated him, and I paid the price." Her assistant hesitated, then offered a tentative suggestion. Maybe this is a chance to learn something. To grow." Margaret nodded slowly, though her expression remained troubled. She knew he was right, but admitting it didn't make the sting of defeat any easier to bear. As she walked out of the courthouse, she spotted the young man surrounded by supporters. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the crowded plaza. Margaret hesitated, then approached him cautiously. "Excuse me," she said, her tone unusually soft. "Can we talk for a minute?" The young man turned to face her, his expression guarded but polite. "Of course," he replied, stepping aside from the group. They found a quiet corner away from the noise. Margaret fidgeted with her briefcase, struggling to find the right words. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I treated you unfairly. I judged you before giving you a chance, and that was wrong. You proved me wrong in every possible way." The young man studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "We all make mistakes," he said finally. "What matters is what we do after realizing them." Margaret nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you for saying that, and thank you for teaching me something important today." She extended her hand, and after a brief pause, the young man shook it firmly. There was no animosity in the gesture, only mutual respect. That evening, Margaret returned home exhausted but restless. She couldn't stop thinking about the trial, the strategies, the arguments, and most importantly, the young man's resilience. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring out at the city skyline. Her career had been built on winning, on proving herself superior in every courtroom battle. But now, she wondered if there was more to being a lawyer than just securing victories. Maybe it was about fairness, empathy, and using her skills to help those who needed it most. Inspired by the young man's passion for justice, Margaret decided to take action. Over the following weeks, she reached out to local nonprofit organizations that provided free legal aid to marginalized communities. At first, volunteering felt unfamiliar, humbling even, but it quickly became fulfilling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Listening to people's stories, helping them navigate complex legal systems, reminded her why she had chosen this profession in the first place. Slowly but surely, she began to rebuild her reputation, not as someone who crushed opponents, but as someone who fought for fairness. As for the young man, his life changed in ways he hadn't imagined. News of his courtroom performance caught the attention of a prestigious law firm, which offered him a scholarship to attend law school. It was an opportunity he had dreamed of but never thought possible. With renewed determination, he threw himself into his studies, determined to use his education to make a difference. Years later, the young man graduated at the top of his class and went on to become one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. He dedicated his career to representing those who couldn't afford legal representation, ensuring that everyone had a fair shot at justice. His story served as a beacon of hope for countless others, proof that perseverance and integrity could overcome even the toughest odds. Margaret kept tabs on his progress from afar, proud of the impact he continued to make. Though their paths rarely crossed again, she often reflected on that pivotal trial, the day she learned humility and witnessed true brilliance in action. It had been a turning point for both of them, shaping the trajectories of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. In the end, the trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was about growth, redemption, and the enduring power of belief in oneself and in others. And as both the young man and Margaret discovered, sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones we see coming. They're the ones that change us forever. Years passed, and the courtroom trial that had once gripped the city became a distant memory for most people. But for the two individuals at its center, the young man who defied expectations and the seasoned prosecutor who underestimated him, it remained a defining moment that shaped their lives in profound ways. Though they never crossed paths again after that brief conversation outside the courthouse, the ripple effects of that day continued to influence everything they did. For the young man, life took on a new rhythm. The scholarship he earned opened doors he had only dreamed of, but it wasn't without challenges. Law school was tough, even tougher than teaching himself from borrowed books, but he approached every obstacle with the same determination that had carried him through the trial. Late nights turned into early mornings as he balanced classes, internships, and part-time jobs to support himself. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the weight of his responsibilities felt unbearable. But whenever he faltered, he remembered the courtroom, the hushed silence, the jury's verdict, and the realization that he had proven something not just to others but to himself. By the time he graduated, he had earned more than just a degree. He had built a reputation. His professors spoke highly of him, praising his sharp mind and unwavering commitment to justice. Fellow students admired his humility, noting how he always made time to help classmates struggling with complex legal concepts. When he accepted an offer from a prominent civil rights law firm, it felt like the culmination of years of hard work, yet deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. As a practicing attorney, he dedicated himself to representing those who often fell through the cracks, people facing discrimination, wrongful convictions, or systemic neglect. Each case reminded him of his own journey, of what it meant to feel powerless and voiceless. He fought tirelessly for his clients, not because he wanted fame or recognition, but because he believed everyone deserved a fair chance. Over time, his name became synonymous with integrity and resilience, Journalists wrote profiles about him, calling him a force for change and a beacon of hope. But despite the accolades, he stayed grounded, remembering where he came from and why he started this journey in the first place. Margaret, too, underwent a transformation. After the trial, she threw herself into her volunteer work, finding purpose in helping marginalized communities navigate the legal system. At first, it was daunting. She had spent decades operating in high-stakes courtrooms, accustomed to commanding attention and respect. Now she found herself sitting across from people who barely trusted her, let alone understood their rights. It was humbling, and sometimes frustrating, but also deeply rewarding. One particular case stood out to her. A single mother had been wrongfully evicted from her apartment due to a clerical error. Margaret worked tirelessly to gather evidence, file appeals, and ultimately secure justice for the woman. When the judge ruled in their favor, the mother broke down in tears, thanking Margaret profusely. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond winning a case. It wasn't about proving herself smarter or better than anyone else. It was about making a real difference in someone's life. Inspired by these experiences, Margaret began advocating for reforms within the legal system. She gave talks at conferences, wrote opinion pieces for newspapers, and collaborated with organizations working to address inequality. Her colleagues noticed a shift in her demeanor. Gone was the brash, overconfident lawyer who thrived on dominating opponents. In her place stood someone wiser, kinder, and more empathetic. A person who understood that justice wasn't just about rules and procedures, but about humanity. Though their careers took different paths, the young man and Margaret occasionally thought about each other. Margaret kept clippings of news articles about the young man's achievements, marveling at how far he had come since that fateful trial. She often wondered if he realized the impact he'd had on her, not just professionally, but personally. For the young man, memories of Margaret lingered as well. He didn't hold any grudges against her. Instead, he saw her as a reminder of how powerful redemption could be. If someone like her could change, then surely there was hope for anyone willing to try. Decades later, the young man found himself standing before a packed auditorium, delivering a keynote speech at a conference on social justice. As he recounted his journey, from self-taught law student to respected attorney, he paused to reflect on the lessons he had learned along the way. "None of us are defined by our mistakes," he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "What matters is how we respond to them. Do we let failure break us, or do we use it as fuel to grow? That choice is ours to make." In the audience, Margaret sat quietly, listening intently. She had decided to attend the conference almost on a whim, curious to hear what the young man might say. When he finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause, rising to their feet in admiration. Margaret joined them, clapping enthusiastically, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Afterward, she approached him hesitantly, unsure if he would remember her. To her surprise, he recognized her immediately. "It's good to see you," he said warmly, extending his hand. This time, their handshake lingered longer, charged with mutual respect and understanding. They exchanged a few words, catching up briefly before parting ways once more. But as Margaret walked away, she couldn't help but smile. The young man's journey had inspired countless others, including her. And in some small way, she hoped, her own efforts had contributed to creating a fairer, more compassionate world. The story of the trial faded into history, but its legacy endured. It served as a reminder that even in the face of adversity, courage and perseverance could lead to extraordinary outcomes. For the young man, it was proof that no dream was too big if you were willing to fight for it. For Margaret, it was a lesson in humility and growth. Together they showed that justice isn't just about winning or losing. It's about learning, evolving, and striving to leave the world better than you found it. And so, their lives intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. The courtroom may have been the stage where their stories collided, but the true impact of that day rippled outward, touching countless lives and inspiring generations to come.